Glacier National Park is a popular outdoor place for countless Americans, and it is like a shining pearl embedded in the North American continent, attracting tourists from far and wide with its magnificent mountains, vast forests, and crystal clear lakes. Hikers weave through the forest trails, feeling the dappled light and shadows of the sun shining through the gaps in the leaves. Campers sit around campfires, with laughter echoing through the valley. The children's eyes widen, and they watch curiously at the occasional squirrel and fawn. The park's rangers do their duty to maintain order in this paradise. On August 12, 1967, 20-year-old coons, Dunn, Nosek, Ray, and Huckle arrived in this paradise with a vision of life in the wild. However, what awaited them would be a bloody journey to death. On the afternoon of the 12th, the five of them sat together, sharing each other's stories and dreams. Their faces were full of youthful vitality and innocence, just as they were immersed in laughter. A scrawny female grizzly bear quietly walked into their field of vision from the dark woods next to them. Its fur was disorganized. Its ribs were prominent beneath its thin body, and hunger burned like a ghost fire in its sunken eyes. In fact, it was normal to see wild grizzly bears in this forest park, and for decades, grizzly bears had lived in harmony with people, and visitors could even touch grizzly bears directly, so the five of them didn't pay much attention to it at first. However, this grizzly bear had been hovering around the five people and did not leave, and its demeanor was very strange. It slowly approached the camp, sniffing incessantly, and easily snatched up some of the food that had been scattered around. Seeing that the grizzly bear had come to the front, several people hurriedly ran out of the camp and watched from a distance. The grizzly bear hadn't left their camp for a long time. The five people watched as the grizzly climbed into their tent and took one man's backpack with it. This bear was so weird. The five were so frightened, after discussion, they decided to go farther away and set up their tents again. To be on the safe side, they decided to move their sleeping bags to the lake and light a vigorous bonfire in the hope of keeping out a possible grizzly infestation again. Flames rose in the night sky, sparks splashed and crackled, as if the five were declaring war on the fear of the unknown. And the hungry grizzly bear also saw the campfire as a signal for a declaration of war. At midnight, there was a slight noise in the camp, and the sound woke Huckle from her sleep. She opened her eyes in a daze, and through the hazy moonlight, she caught a glimpse of a large black shadow swaying at the edge of the camp. Fear instantly spread through her body like an electric current, and her heart began to beat violently, almost bursting through her chest. Why was it here? Paul and the team also woke up, but he was not so lucky, only to see the grizzly swaggering towards him. Paul immediately pretended to be dead, hoping that the grizzly bear would not notice him. However, the grizzly bear actually recognized that Paul was still a living person and bit Paul's leg. How could this pain be bearable? Paul wailed in pain, then fought the pain in his leg and got up and climbed to a nearby tree. Everyone was frightened, and in a panic, they climbed up the tree to avoid the frenzied grizzly bear. But after they gathered, they counted carefully. There were only 4 people. Where was Coons? At the camp, her sleeping bag got stuck in a zipper. She couldn't climb out. It was too late, and Grizzly noticed her. In the moonlight, the grizzly bear was standing next to Michelle Coons' sleeping bag, sniffing incessantly with its nose. Extreme fear caused Coons' screams to pierce the silent night sky and reverberate back and forth through the valley. The terrible cry was like igniting a powder keg, angering the hungry beast in front of her. The grizzly opened its bloody jaws and dragged her out of her sleeping bag. Coons struggled desperately. Her hands were waving wildly in the air. Her fingernails were scratching shallow marks on the bear's paws. But the insignificant resistance seemed so powerless in the face of the grizzly bear's brute force. Her feet trailed a messy trail on the ground, accompanied by screams of despair as she was dragged deep into the darkness of the woods by the grizzly bear. When the 4 people in the tree came to their senses, they only heard the fainter and fainter screams of Coons in the night, which lasted for about dozens of minutes, accompanied by the sound of bones being gnawed. Then the screams grew fainter and weaker, until the sound was completely swallowed up by the endless darkness, and the silence around them returned to death. The 4 men in the tree were stunned, and it was an hour and a half before they got down from the tree and ran to the ranger's quarters to report what they had just experienced. After listening to their story, Ranger Landis said that he had heard his colleague talk about it on the intercom. Hearing this, The remaining 4 people immediately shuddered. There were only 4 witnesses to the attack, and Coons had been taken by a bear. So who told the Rangers about this before? At this time, Landa didn't realize that there was more than one grizzly bear murder tragedy in the park that night, and he had only heard about another tragedy before the 4 arrived. There was a bear in the park that went crazy and killed 2 people. At about the same time that Coons was killed, the same nightmare was unfolding at the Granite Park Cottage, not far from Trout Lake Camp. Now, let's turn the clock back to the afternoon. At the time, 18-year-old Roy and 19-year-old Julie chose to pitch their tent in a quiet spot near the cottage, and the couple was enjoying their romantic camping time. They snuggled up to each other in their sleeping bags, looking forward to a better life in the future, but they did not realize that danger was approaching. In the middle of the night, Roy inexplicably woke up in his sleep, and a strong sense of unease came over him. He slowly opened his eyes, and in an instant, the blood in his whole body seemed to freeze. In the moonlight, a huge grizzly bear stood in front of their tent, its cold eyes staring at them as if it came from the abyss. Roy hurriedly pretended to be dead, however. Grizzly seemed to see through his ploy and walked straight over to him, and then began to bite his left arm. Roy resisted the pain and did not make a sound. The bitter ploy seemed to work, and the grizzly relented after about a dozen seconds. Unbeknownst to Roy at this time, the nightmare had just begun. The grizzly let out a dull roar and pounced on Julie. Julie's eyes widened in horror, and her hands flailed in vain in the air, trying to fend off the sudden, deadly attack. But who is the opponent of bears? The grizzly bear's paws slammed into her body in an instant, knocking her to the ground. Blood gushed from her mouth, staining the grass beneath her red. Immediately afterward, the grizzly turned around and lunged at Roy again. Roy instinctively shielded his head with his arms, and the grizzly bear's claws slashed across his arms and back, tearing open several bloody cuts. The pain in his heart made him almost faint, but the desire to survive drove him to do his best, and under another pounce from the grizzly bear, he flashed sideways, staggered to his feet, and ran desperately in the direction of the hut. The grizzly bear didn't chase him, but behind him was Julie's desperate cry, a voice full of fear and helplessness, echoing through the mountains and forests. Roy stumbled along the way, with his blood leaving a shocking trail behind him at last. He ran to the hut and knocked on the door with the last of his strength. The occupants of the house were awakened by the rapid knock on the door, and when the ranger opened the door to see Roy, covered in blood and with empty eyes, they were stunned by what they saw. In the second half of the night, the park rangers began a difficult search. Near 3 o'clock, Julie was found in the woods behind the cottage in Granite Park, and when she was first found, she still had her breath, but her body had been torn beyond recognition, and the surrounding land was soaked in blood, showing a large dark red patch. She passed away shortly after being taken to the hospital, and it is hard to imagine what kind of pain she experienced along the way. Early in the morning, they found Coon's mutilated body near the Trout Lake Camp. The tragic scene made these tough guys, who were used to seeing natural cruelty, couldn't help but churn in their stomachs. This is not the most terrifying. What is even more terrifying is that the distance between the 2 places in this case is too long, so the same bear did not have enough speed to travel between the 2 places to kill people in an hour or 2. On the same night, 2 bears were killing people at the same time. You know, animal experts had previously estimated that the probability of a grizzly bear injuring a person in the park was very, very low, and visitors here had never had a problem with grizzly bears for decades. It was hard to believe that a grizzly bear would kill someone, and 2 grizzly bears actually kill people at the same time on the same day. Can the animals discuss the killing plan? How could it be such a coincidence if there was no negotiation? Once such an idea is formed in the mind, it lingers like a ghost, adding a mysterious and strange color to the already terrifying event. However, as the follow-up investigation deepened, the truth of the facts gradually emerged. Although the 2 tragedies occurred on the same night, there was no so-called grizzly conspiracy. When environmental experts came to the park to investigate, the secret of the grizzly bear's collective attack was finally revealed. In the 60s of the 20th century, the United States was in the midst of a boom period of rapid economic development. People's enthusiasm for outdoor recreation was high, and the number of visitors to Glacier National Park increased dramatically. This was a good opportunity for the development of the park, but it also brought a series of unexpected problems. Park management was struggling to cope with the piles of garbage. They simply and rudely piled up the garbage, and these garbage heaps that exuded the aroma of food had become a treasure trove of food in the eyes of grizzly bears. The grizzly bears relied on this garbage for a long time, and the habits of them had gradually become distorted. They no longer had to go to the mountains and forests to hunt, but were accustomed to rummaging through the garbage heap every day to find food. And in their eyes, humans were slowly changing from strange creatures that needed to be feared to food providers. As early as 1966, some visitors reported that grizzly bears could often be seen up close in the park. And some local people also warned that grizzly bears were too close to humans and that sooner or later something would happen. But these warnings were like a stone sinking into the sea, and the park's top management was blindly optimistic and even declared that the grizzly bear's danger level was close to zero, without the slightest intention of strengthening management. What about tourists? They were carried away by the beautiful scenery of the park, and they fed the grizzly bears wantonly. They just wanted to take a photo with the wild beasts, watching the grizzly bears snatch food in a cute manner. But they did not know that they were wearing away, little by little, the grizzly bear's natural awe of humans. Grizzly bears had become less afraid of people, but had associated humans with providing food. And when bears fell into a state of starvation, they would naturally associate with looking for humans, or even treating humans as food. In the aftermath, Glacier Park found a hunting team to hunt grizzly bears near the place where the crime occurred, because animals that killed people, or animals that had the potential to kill people, must be killed in the end. The hunting team found the two bears that killed Coons and Julie through large-scale hunting and corpse identification. One of the murderous grizzly bears suffered an injury to its paw pads, and every attempt to hunt was accompanied by a pain that forced it to abandon its traditional way of survival. Another murderous grizzly bear had glass shards embedded in its mouth, and its feeding had become a form of torture. It had to survive on the scraps of easily accessible human food. Hunger and pain were intertwined, and that night they set their eyes on the unsuspecting campers. In the aftermath of Grizzly Night, Glacier National Park and the entire U.S. National Park system were completely awakened by the bloody storm. The park quickly introduced a series of strict new regulations. Food must be stored properly in the camping area, and any form of feeding is strictly prohibited, and violators are severely fined. The rangers stepped up patrols, closely monitoring the movements of grizzly bears. They took measures such as driving away grizzly bears when they were found to be frequently approaching human activity areas to ensure the safety of tourists. Nature is not the backyard of human beings, and wild animals also have an untouchable wild bottom line. The tragic photos published on the front pages of newspapers and the grief of survivors on television news made everyone who saw and heard it feel uneasy. Since then, visitors to the national park have put away their indulgence and carefully maintained a delicate balance with wildlife. Over the years, the wounds in Glacier National Park have slowly healed, and some of its former tranquility has been restored. But on the night of August 12th, when the moonlight shines on the ruins of Lake Trout and the Granite Park Cottage, it is as if you can still hear the terrible screams of that night. The huge grizzly bear figure shuttling through the trees is a constant reminder that this bloody tragedy of human and bear and the heavy warning behind it should never be forgotten. Let's have more reverence for the natural world